Question: how can we convince others of the existence of God? Before we convince somebody of something, we must know that thing ourselves. How can we convince anybody of the existence of something that we ourselves don't know? It is basically wrong, and whenever it comes to God, this very essential point is overlooked. There are people who themselves have not known God, and they are trying to convince others. And then there are atheists who are trying to convince others of non-existence of God. And what difference does it make, even if the whole world is convinced that God exists? Is it going to enlighten you? Is it going to help to know God? Even if the other is convinced, our ignorance remains the same. But this question comes from a very general tendency that we are trying to convince people of the things that we don't know, that we don't understand. We talk about love, we talk about God, we talk about trust. We talk about so many things, and we just talk. We don't stop and look within and try to see whether we know what we want others to know. So the very first step is to know God yourself. And how can you know God? God cannot be understood. God cannot be perceived in language. God can be perceived only in silence. For ages, people have been fighting over one concept or the other of God. Everybody is trying to prove himself or his own version of God as the ultimate version, because that concept is based on certain beliefs, certain books. So we stick to those books, to those ideas of God. Hence, so much conflict in the world. Philosophers, thinkers, everybody is just talking. God can never be realized through this talk, through this mental exercise. God can be realized only in silence. When you are utterly silent inside, all of a sudden you feel God. You don't define God in terms of language. You just feel the presence, the silent presence. And this God, the presence, is formless. is nameless. And once you know this God in your silence, for the first time you realize that there is no need to convince anybody. Why? What is the point of convincing others? Why to make a futile effort? Convincing is an effort. You have to use right kind of arguments, proper logic you have to be equipped with. Then there would be counter logic, counter arguments. This is what convincing entails. Remember, whosoever knows, feels God, never tries to convince anybody of his existence. Because this is fundamentally stupid. How can I try to convince you of something I already know? Yes, I can share the knowledge with you. I can convey something to you. Conveying and convincing are altogether different things. In convincing, there is an effort, whereas conveying is effortless. You simply say what you feel, and it is absolutely irrelevant whether the other follows it or not. So let this be a parameter that whenever you have a desire to convince others, you have not known God. And the day this desire disappears, know well that you have known God. Look around yourself. Does God ever try to convince anybody of his existence? There is no effort. God simply enjoys his own existence. He celebrates his own being. And once you know God, you start celebrating. And that celebration is the proof, that celebration is the evidence that God is. In your celebration, God is reflected. In your joy, God is mirrored. Look around yourself. Look at trees and the birds and infinite colors and infinite sounds of the birds. Aren't they enough proof that there is somebody? Every single object inside us and outside of us, from gigantic galaxies to tiny, almost invisible particles, carry the proof that there is some creator. Everything is so beautifully, joyfully ordered. There are trillions of particles inside our body, and they are moving inside our body at unimaginable speed. Every single object in the world proves that God is. But even if we reject it as merely natural functions, God never bothers about it. The very proof that there is an effort around the world to convince others is the proof that there is little godliness in the world. In a world where there is godliness, there will be no effort. It will be so spontaneous. Look at the face of a baby. His smile shows that he is happy, he is joyful. That smile is the symbol of his joy. He never tries to convince us. So, and there are people merely by looking at them, you can feel the existence of God. Their eyes, their gestures, their postures, their words, and their silence. Everything is so poetic. This is the proof. And they simply exist, these people, these saints, these mystics, these Buddhas. They simply, spontaneously live their lives. And in this spontaneity, we feel life, we feel existence. So remember one thing, that you have to know God above all. Your whole effort, your whole energy should be directed towards knowing God first. And once you know God, your very presence will be an indicator, will be a sign that God exists. There is a story in the Bible. Some people brought Mary Magdalene to Jesus. She was accused of adultery, and those people wanted to somehow trap Jesus. They wanted somehow to extract some kind of blasphemous statement so that they could punish him, they could get rid of him. So they brought Mary to Jesus. And they asked Jesus to judge Mary. They knew that Jesus would not punish Mary Magdalene according to the old gospel. The gospel says that anybody found committing adultery should be stoned to death. So they forced Jesus to judge Mary. And Jesus said simply that yes, you should follow the gospel. The gospel says that such a person should be stoned to death. So go ahead, kill her, punish her. But he who himself is sinless should throw the first stone. One who himself has not committed any sin deserves to throw the first stone. And something happened in the hearts of those hypocrites, those priests. Something was stirred inside. In the presence of Jesus, in his divine silence, something penetrated them. They were shaken, and they dropped the stones they had actually picked up, and they moved away. I'm sure They were not converted by Jesus at that moment. It was not a permanent change of heart. It was momentary. It was temporary. But that temporary change, those thick-skinned priests who had spent their whole lives in hypocrisy, all of a sudden they were awakened. There was one moment of awakening. In that moment, they could see the truth. What did Jesus do? Nothing much. In fact, he agreed with the priests. Just one statement, just simple one statement, that he who has not committed any sin should throw the first stone. This simple statement. He was not trying to convince them using elaborate logic, arguments, just one statement, and they were shaken. That single statement came from a divine soul. Somebody who had experienced divinity himself. This statement came from his core, from his center. It was not a superficial statement. So, what do we see? Words were not important there. Jesus just spoke a handful of words, just few words. But behind those words was shining his divine self. So, if you yourself have got that divine element inside you, your presence will convince everybody. You don't have to make an effort. You just have to be. And in that being, the others will feel God.